Boston Harbor looks calm in winter, until you notice the clock. 3 tea ships sit in the water like loaded dice, and everyone in town knows a customs deadline is coming. If the tea lands, the tax becomes real. If it doesn't, something bigger will happen. This is the moment when protest starts mutating into revolution. Britain had just won a massive global war, and winning was expensive. Soldiers had to be paid, ships maintained, and new territories administered. In London, leaders looked at the empire like a ledger and asked one question: who should help pay? Their answer pointed straight across the Atlantic. Parliament believed the colonies benefited from protection, so the colonies should contribute through taxes. But the colonists heard something else: decisions without representation. The argument wasn't only money, it was power. Who gets to make rules for people who live an ocean away? Boston lived on trade, and trade often lived in the shadows. Smuggled goods dodged duties, merchants and sailors knew the shortcuts of the coast. To Britain, smuggling looked like cheating. To many colonists it looked like survival and resistance, long before anyone tossed tea into the sea. When Britain tried direct internal taxation earlier, the colonies erupted. Boycotts, protests, and political organizing. The Stamp Act was repealed, but the lesson cut both ways. Colonists learned that coordinated pressure works. Britain learned that backing down once doesn't end the problem, it just changes the strategy. In New England, politics didn't live only in palaces. It lived in town meetings. Ordinary people argued, voted, and pressured leaders face to face. Organizers like Samuel Adams understood that crowds are power if you can focus them, and focused crowds can become institutions. Violence had already scarred Boston's relationship with British troops. After the Boston Massacre, even calm moments carried suspicion. When soldiers stand in your streets, every argument feels like it's happening under a loaded musket. Trust doesn't break in one day. It fractures in layers. Before phones and social media, politics moved through letters, riders, and trusted networks. Committees of correspondence connected towns, sharing warnings and plans. This made resistance scalable. One port's crisis could become everyone's crisis. In a conflict, information is logistics. Tea was popular, at breakfast tables, in shops, in homes. That's why taxing it mattered. It touched daily life. And because tea came through ports, a tea tax also meant port control. The fight over tea was really a fight over who controlled the economic throat of the colony. By 1773, both sides were locked into stubborn positions. Britain needed revenue and authority. Boston needed dignity and control over its own rules. When two systems refused to yield, the conflict looks for a new outlet. That outlet was tea. The East India Company was drowning in unsold tea and financial trouble. In London, saving the company felt like saving the empire's trade machine. So Parliament looked for a shortcut: let the company sell directly to the colonies. The plan was supposed to lower prices and increase compliance. It did neither. The Tea Act made legal tea cheaper by cutting some costs and letting the company ship directly. But it kept the small townshend duty, the symbol tax. Colonists saw a clever trick. Cheaper tea would tempt people to accept Parliament's right to tax. The bargain became a test of obedience. Local merchants and smugglers saw the Tea Act as monopoly politics. If the company controlled the tea pipeline, independent traders would be squeezed out. When a market is threatened, people don't argue politely, they mobilize. Economics turned into street politics. The company appointed consignees, agents who would receive and sell the tea. That put real names on an abstract law. Protest needs targets, and now it had them. Social pressure began immediately. Warnings, boycotts, and the threat of crowd action. Smuggling wasn't just rebellion, it was an alternate business model. Legal tea threatened profits built on dodging duties. Britain tried to replace the shadow economy with a controlled tax channel. The conflict wasn't morals versus crime, it was competing incentive systems. Colonists used boycotts like a lever: refuse goods, squeeze profits, force political attention. A boycott is powerful because it turns everyone into a participant. Buyers, sellers, sailors. The question became, can Boston hold the line when the tea arrives? Anger is easy, coordination is hard. Organizers built routines, meetings, signals, watchers on the docks, and rapid messaging. They learned how to direct a crowd without letting it become a riot. That discipline would matter on the crucial night. Governor Hutchinson believed the tea must be landed, and the law followed. He also had political ties and a reputation to defend. To him, backing down invited chaos. To Boston, forcing the landing invited surrender. Both sides said they wanted order, just not the same kind of order. In London, leaders assumed cheaper tea would calm things down. They underestimated how symbolic the tax had become. They also underestimated how organized Boston was. Distance doesn't just slow information, it distorts it. Once the tea ships left port, the decision space shrank. Policies became physical objects. Crates, manifests, and hulls cutting through cold Atlantic water. Now the question wasn't, should we do this? But, what happens when it arrives? In late November 1773, the first tea ship, Dartmouth, arrived in Boston. With it came the countdown. After a set number of days, customs could seize and land the cargo. The harbor became a timer you could see. Everyone started watching the water. Boston didn't wait for tea to be unloaded. People organized waterfront watches, tracking movement and discouraging secret nighttime landings. The crowd itself became enforcement, unofficial but effective. When a city watches together, hiding becomes expensive. Meetings swelled until buildings overflowed. In the Old South Meeting House, thousands packed together to debate, vote, and demand action. Samuel Adams and other leaders didn't control every person, but they shaped the agenda. This was crowd power with procedure. Boston's core demand was simple: let the ships leave without unloading. If the tea departed, the tax didn't get paid. Hutchinson refused, insisting the law required landing. The standoff was now clear: a community versus an imperial deadline. Consignees faced a personal crisis. If they accepted the tea, they became symbols of surrender. If they refused, they risked angering powerful backers. Boston's resistance used shame, public meetings, and social isolation as weapons. The goal was to break the chain before the tea touched land. Soon more tea ships arrived, multiplying the problem. More cargo meant more pressure and more chances for something to slip through. The harbor felt crowded with consequence. Each additional hull was another vote for confrontation. Customs rules created a ticking mechanism. After the deadline, officials could legally seize the tea and unload it themselves. That meant Boston had a limited window to win without breaking the law, at least on paper. When law becomes a timer, politics becomes a race. Not everyone wanted dramatic action. Some hoped negotiation or delay would solve it. Others believed only a bold act would prevent the tea from landing. Disagreement is normal, but deadlines punish indecision. The closer the clock got, the louder the hardliners became. A successful mass action needs roles: watchers, leaders, muscle, logistics, and exit routes. The organizers quietly arranged these pieces. No one wanted a plan written down. Paper can be seized. Instead, the city used trust, familiarity, and repetition. By early December, compromise was fading. Hutchinson held the legal line. Boston held the moral line. The ship sat trapped between them, and the deadline turned the trap into a trigger. The harbor was now a locked box, and tea was the fuse inside. On December 16, thousands gathered again, knowing time was almost out. Messengers reported negotiations failing. People listened for any sign of a compromise. Every minute that passed pushed Boston closer to choosing a line it couldn't uncross. Merchants and leaders tried one more time to convince Hutchinson to allow the ships to depart. Hutchinson refused. He believed yielding would destroy authority. In that refusal, he unknowingly handed the crowd the only remaining option that would stop the tea. If the deadline hit, customs could seize the cargo and unload it under protection. That would turn protest into defeat with a signature. So the crowd's logic became simple: stop unloading by making unloading impossible. It was escalation driven by policy design. Some participants used symbolic disguises to signal that they were stepping outside normal rules. It offered anonymity and a shared identity during a risky act. The key point is not the costume itself, but the unity it created at a critical moment. The plan required discipline. The goal was to destroy the tea, not to harm people or steal property. Reports from the night described strict rules: no unnecessary damage, no private looting, and order on the decks. That discipline helped the action look like political theater rather than chaos. Ships sat at the junction of law and commerce. Tea on board was still a possibility. Tea on land became a tax victory. That made the decks a political stage. If you controlled the ship, you controlled the meaning of the Tea Act, at least for that night. British troops were present in Boston, but intervention on the docks risked sparking immediate violence. Commanders weighed the cost of escalation. On that night, the system hesitated: enforce strictly and ignite chaos, or hold back and accept humiliation. Sometimes restraint is a strategic choice. As the meeting concluded and people moved toward the harbor, the city's energy shifted. Individuals became a flow. In crowd moments, emotion spreads like weather. Fast, everywhere, hard to stop. Boston was now a single moving wave. The action focused on 3 ships. Boarding wasn't random, it was targeted. Teams moved onto decks, found the holds, and began hauling crates. The goal was speed and clarity. Tea out, nothing else touched. Once the first crate was opened, the argument shifted from words to consequences. Boston had crossed into direct action against imperial policy. Hutchinson would now be judged in London for losing control. Boston would now be judged at home for daring to resist. The spiral accelerated. The Boston Tea Party was loud in history, but it was also practical. People had to move heavy crates, open them, and dump the contents efficiently. The harbor became a nighttime work site with a political purpose. Even rebellion has logistics. Teams went into the holds and brought up chest after chest. They avoided unnecessary damage because the message mattered. This is protest, not piracy. The cleaner the operation, the clearer the signal. That's why discipline was the real secret weapon. Tea poured into the water in huge amounts, turning the harbor surface into a symbol. It was wasteful by design. The point was refusal, not profit. A product became a protest sign, and the ocean carried that sign beyond Boston's shore. Stories from the night describe how participants enforced rules against stealing. That mattered because it protected legitimacy. If people started grabbing goods, the act would look like crime, not politics. Self-policing kept the protest coherent. Ship crews were in a strange position. Interfering could trigger violence, and many were outnumbered. Some simply stood aside, unwilling to become targets. In moments like this, neutrality is also a choice, one made under pressure. The work became repetition. Haul, open, dump, move on. Repetition makes large actions possible in short time. In the end, it wasn't one dramatic gesture. It was dozens of coordinated motions. That's how a crowd becomes a machine. People watched from shore, windows, and rooftops. Some felt triumph, some felt dread. Everyone understood that Britain would respond. A revolutionary moment often feels like 2 emotions at once: victory and fear. When the dumping ended, participants cleared the decks and disappeared into the night. Leaving order behind was part of the statement. The tea was gone, but Boston's discipline remained visible. It was a protest with a signature style. By morning, the harbor told the story without words. Merchants calculated the loss. Leaders calculated the response. Ordinary people wondered if the line they crossed would bring freedom or disaster. The Tea Party created a new reality. Britain could no longer pretend Boston would comply. To London, this wasn't just property damage. It looked like rebellion, a colony rejecting Parliament's authority in public. The Tea Party forced Britain to choose between compromise and punishment. And punishment, as Boston would learn, can unify the people you're trying to isolate. In London, leaders faced a choice: back down and invite more resistance, or punish Boston to restore authority. Empires run on examples. If Boston got away with it, other ports might copy the tactic. So the response aimed to be loud. Parliament passed a package of harsh measures, later called the Coercive Acts. The goal was to isolate Boston, change Massachusetts' governance, and strengthen enforcement. It was policy as punishment, and punishment changes incentives quickly. Closing the port was like cutting oxygen to a trade city. Dock workers lost work, merchants lost income, and families felt the squeeze. Britain hoped pain would produce obedience. But pain can also produce solidarity, especially when people believe it's unfair. Britain also changed how Massachusetts could govern itself, limiting local power. This wasn't just economic pressure, it was political redesign. When people lose the ability to choose leaders, they feel like subjects, not citizens. That emotional shift matters. More troops and enforcement meant more daily friction. Patrols, inspections, arguments. Even without battles, constant presence changes a community's mood. The political temperature rises because people feel watched, and watched people organize. Military authority tightened under General Thomas Gage. Britain believed a firm hand would restore order. But militarizing governance often has the opposite effect. It turns disagreement into a security crisis, and security crises justify more force, a self-feeding loop. Instead of isolating Boston, the port closure sparked support. Other colonies sent food and supplies, treating Boston as a test case. A local conflict became a shared identity story. If they can do this to Boston, they can do it to us. Committees and networks multiplied, standardizing messages and decisions. This is how movements scale. You turn spontaneous outrage into repeatable process. Britain had laws. The colonies built coordination. Two systems prepared to collide. Both sides fought for legitimacy. Patriots framed British acts as tyranny. British officials framed resistance as lawlessness. Printing presses and pamphlets became weapons that fired ideas instead of bullets. Winning the story helps you win the future. Britain aimed to isolate Massachusetts. Instead, it connected the colonies emotionally and politically. The coercive response turned Boston's tea protest into a continental cause. When punishment changes their problem into our problem, it accelerates history. If colonies were going to resist effectively, they needed to coordinate beyond letters and sympathy. The idea of a Continental Congress grew from necessity. Shared strategy, shared decisions, shared messaging. Once representatives meet, a movement becomes an institution. In Philadelphia, representatives argued about how far to go. Some wanted petitions, others wanted stronger measures. But even disagreement showed progress. They were acting together. Coordination is power before any army exists. Congress backed non-importation and economic pressure, aiming to hit Britain where it hurt, profits. A boycott at continental scale turns countless small choices into a giant lever. It's slow force, but it moves empires when people commit. Colonial leaders often pursued two tracks: ask for rights while preparing for conflict. That may sound contradictory, but it's rational under uncertainty. If Britain compromises, preparation is a safety net. If Britain escalates, preparation becomes survival. Militias drilled more seriously as tensions rose. These were not yet armies. They were communities practicing coordination. Training is a signal. We are preparing to resist. Signals change opponents' calculations. British authorities looked for ways to prevent rebellion. Seize weapons, control powder, enforce laws. Preventive enforcement can feel like oppression when trust is gone. Each seizure confirmed fears and created new volunteers for resistance. Massachusetts turned into a political laboratory. Britain tried stronger control here first. Patriots tested coordination here first. When both sides treat a place as the test case, escalation becomes likely because each wants the lesson to be clear. Local committees started managing supplies, militia readiness, and decisions. Functions of government. This is a major threshold. When people build parallel institutions, they're preparing to live without the old authority. Revolution isn't only fighting. its replacement. Supplies were moved to inland depots like Concord, away from British ships and garrisons. Moving resources changes the battlefield before a battle exists. It's chess with barrels and roads, and the opponent can see the board shifting. By early 1775, both sides had built machinery for conflict. Britain had laws and troops. The colonies had networks and militias. The next spark would ignite prepared fuel. And prepared fuel doesn't just burn, it explodes into something new. British leaders wanted Massachusetts brought to heel. Military orders emphasized restoring authority and preventing stockpiles from feeding rebellion. In their view, a quick show of force could reset the system. In the colonies' view, it proved the system was turning hostile. In 1774, rumors of British moves, like seizures of powder, triggered sudden militia mobilization. Even when details were unclear, the reaction showed how prime the countryside had become. Rumor can be dangerous, but it also reveals readiness. People were waiting for a trigger. Boston used riders to spread warnings quickly. The famous names matter, but the system matters more. A network of messengers, signals, and local responders. The revolution's early speed came from social infrastructure built during protest years. British troops marched to seize supplies at Concord, hoping to surprise and control. But secrecy is hard in a community that watches. As columns moved, signals raced ahead. The old plan, enforced quietly, failed against a prepared network. At Lexington, militia and regulars faced each other in tense uncertainty. A shot was fired, history still argues by whom, and the meaning was immediate. Unarmed protest had become an armed crisis. Even if the clash was small, the consequences were huge. At Concord, conflict widened, supplies were sought, bridges and roads became choke points, and local resistance stiffened. The British mission became a running problem. Accomplish objectives while being harassed on the way back. Geography and community turned into tactics. On the road back to Boston, British troops faced constant pressure from militia firing from cover. We show this as distance and motion, not injury. The key is the system. Many small groups coordinating across miles can reshape a battle. This is decentralized resistance in action. After Lexington and Concord, militia flowed toward Boston, trapping British forces inside the city. The harbor that once held tea now held soldiers. This is how revolutions harden. The question stops being who is right and becomes who controls space. The Tea Party became a story that recruited people. Not everyone loved the tactics, but the symbolism was powerful. Ordinary people defied a mighty empire. Symbols simplify complex economics into a clear narrative. Clear narratives create commitment. In London, events looked like rebellion spreading. Debate about representation narrowed into a security problem. When governments labeled dissent as rebellion, they opened the door to harsher measures and closed the door to compromise. That shift is often irreversible. For many colonists, the sequence felt like tyranny. Taxes, enforcement, port closure, troops, and now shots fired. The Tea Party wasn't the start of anger. It was the proof that anger had structure. Once people believe the system is rigged, they stop asking politely. The Tea Party can look like simple destruction. But as strategy, it was targeted. Destroy the commodity that carried the tax meaning. It forced Britain to respond, and that response revealed imperial priorities. In political conflict, forcing a choice can be the most powerful move. This story isn't only about heroes or villains. It's about incentives. Debt pushed taxes, taxes pushed resistance, punishment pushed unity, and unity pushed conflict. Networks moved information, crowds provided leverage, and deadlines created triggers. When a system has feedback loops, small events can produce big outcomes. The Boston Tea Party worked because it was both symbolic and practical. It targeted a policy's weak point, the tea itself, before the deadline could turn law into defeat. Britain answered with punishment designed to isolate Boston, but the punishment unified the colonies instead. From there, coordination scaled into Congress, and defense scaled into militia, until shots at Lexington and Concord made the conflict irreversible. History often turns when systems collide, and neither side can back down. If you want more epic moments where one decision changed everything, stay with Tiny Titans History. Subscribe, and we'll keep time traveling one turning point at a time.